All right. Okay, is it back up? Are the slides back up?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Even though the Civil War fighting on the battlefield had stopped, Reconstruction was still, some historians refer to it as a second Civil War. So if it's been a year or so since you've studied American History 1, and maybe you've never studied the Civil War, I want to just make sure you understand a few things that will help us as we start with Reconstruction. Have you ever seen any of those news programs or news magazines that go out on the street and ask people American history questions, or like, who's our president, or who is the vice president, and or what year was our country founded, and who did we fight in the Revolutionary War? Have you ever seen any of those videos? Well, if you haven't, I would sometime go to YouTube and just Google jaywalking with Jay Leno. And he used to go out on the streets and ask people common questions, and it was amazing. He had one segment on the Civil War, and he was like, who won the Civil War? And a lot of people were like, we did. So if I were to ask you who won the Civil War, what would you say?
The North.
The North, right. And who did they defeat?
The South.
South, right. And what are some more technical terms for the North and South?
The Union and Confederacy.
Right, the Union and the Confederacy. And this map just shows you, here's the 11 states in purple that are Confederate, or the South. And then the North is in the blue, even including these three over here. And then we had these territories that were not yet states. So the Civil War, North versus South, Union versus Confederacy. While the overarching issue was state rights, what was the main specific issue that it was fought over?
Trent, why do you want to go?
He has to go to a funeral.
Okay, who is that?
Trent Hildebrand.
Trent? Okay. So even though the main thing was the South wanted to protect state rights, they were afraid of a big federal government. What was the specific issue that was at the heart of it?
The argument about whether owning slaves should be a right they can still keep.
Right. Right. The North wanted to abolish slavery. Is Ricardo coming back?
No, he also has to go to the funeral.
Okay, okay. The North wanted to completely abolish slavery. The South did not just because they wanted to. Is she going to the funeral too? Oh, okay. Not just because they wanted to have the right to own people, but their whole economy was built on slavery. And they had an economy of cotton and tobacco as their main crops, and they needed slave labor to continue to have that economy. Lincoln being elected in 1860 is important to the Civil War. He was the first Republican of what is known as today the modern Republican Party. He was the first Republican. and the Republicans were the ones who were wanting to abolish slavery. He won, and just something that is important to understand, that is the only time a third party won a presidential election, because the Republicans were the new party. Lincoln came in 1861, basically is when he started, and there had already been 7 states that had already left the Union. So he started his presidency with a group of 7 states having already seceded from the Union. I guess none of you were born in 2001. When George Bush started his presidency in January of 2001, he at least had 9 months before the New York City terrorist attacks, but then the rest of his presidency was consumed with that. Lincoln did not have any type of period. He was always dealing with a war. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy, and their capital was in Richmond, Virginia. And the final 4 states had joined the South within Lincoln's first 5 months of office. Just a couple more maps. So I just wanted you to be aware of the two sides in the Civil War, because I'm going to be talking about North, South, Confederates, Union, and in case you weren't familiar with those, I wanted you to have that background. You can see here, these dates aren't very clear. They're kind of fuzzy. Let's go to this one here. Well, I'll go back down there and I'll tell you what they say. You can see here the Emancipation Proclamation, in which Lincoln basically pronounced that all slaves were free. That happened in January of '63, but the war continued on for 2 more years. So even though he made the official proclamation, they were still trying to defeat all of the South. Later on that year, in July of 1863, Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. I'm assuming that most of you had to have read that, or you will read that in your high school career. But also in 1863, this is what I want to come to. Lincoln began to put together his plan for Reconstruction. When we talk about Reconstruction, we're talking about the rebuilding and the reforming of Southern society without slavery. So even though the war is still going, Lincoln is already starting to talk about what he's going to do to bring the South back into the Union and help them rebuild and reform. You can see here, it wasn't until April of 1865 that General Lee surrendered to General Grant, which officially ended the Civil War. But since we're Okies, we need to know this little piece of trivia. The final Civil War general to surrender was 2 months after this. It was a Native American general named Stand Watie from Oklahoma, and he surrendered in July of 1865 at what is now Fort Gibson, Oklahoma. So that's just an interesting piece of Civil War history that relates to our state. If you ever go to Fort Gibson, there is a national cemetery there for veterans, and there is also the old fort that was there during the Civil War. So that is a state historic site to see. Okay, I'm going to switch now to a different slide presentation. Do you see that one there with the flag?
Huh.
Do you see this one with the flag, or is it the old one with a map?
We see the map.
Okay. Hello again. Now do you see it?
Yeah.
All right, so let's begin Reconstruction, and we now understand who the North and the South are, Union and Confederates. Reconstruction, as you will read in chapter 15, is usually confined to a 12-year period. In other words, this is when it began at the official ending of the Civil War, even though Lincoln started to talk about it in 1863. Historians agree that 1877 is when Reconstruction came to an end. What you see here is Richmond, Virginia. This is what pretty much all the buildings look like in downtown Richmond. So when we talk about Reconstruction,
the senior class is taking orders for Krispy Kreme donuts, $10 per dozen. Order by January the 24th. They will be delivered by January the 27th. Please see Ms. Hannes or Ms. Owens for more information. There will be a junior class meeting, the last 5 minutes of second breakfast tomorrow. FCA will be tomorrow at lunch. And congratulations to Ken DeLuz for winning the SCCLA T-shirt Tuesday. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
all right, so which school was that?
Talahina.
Us.
You guys have a second breakfast?
Yeah.
Well, for the people that don't get here on time before first hour.
Okay, okay. Well, you know what that reminds me of?
What?
Now you guys will have to get used to my pop culture references. Let me find it here. Now this is one of those really old movies from the early 2000s called the Lord of the Rings.
Yep. That second breakfast. Yeah, yeah.
You're stealing my thunder, man. Yes, we've had breakfast, but what about second breakfast?
That second breakfast. Really, and I called it.
All right. Anyway, I hope you don't mind pop culture references being sprinkled in every now and then.
No, that's all right.
And don't forget, you got to order by January 24th, whatever that was, on the announcement in Talahina. So this is what a lot of the southern cities look like, the big cities. And the countryside, a lot of it had been set on fire. It had been ravaged by fighting and bombs. And so when we say Reconstruction, we are talking about physical reconstruction as well as the economy, because if you take away slavery, that's what their whole economy was built on. So now you got to rebuild the economy. You have to rebuild the government because all of the state governments now have been considered null and void because they seceded from the Union. So economically, politically, as well as physically, they begin to rebuild all these things in the South. And even though the North won and they're the victors, do you think the South, you think after the war was over, they were like, all right, now we can rebuild and the North's going to help us? Think they were excited about that? We've got the North who wanted to free the slaves. They're going to be our leaders now and tell us how to rebuild. Would that be something that they would have welcomed?
No.
No, not at all. That's why we talk about Reconstruction being another civil war, because you're going to have the Southern political leaders and military leaders and the very wealthy plantation owners resisting what the North wants to do. Here's a little timeline that you'll be able to look at. Now, I will tell you what you need to know for the test. So here's the first thing that I want you to know for the test. And even though it's open book, there's a lot of material in 4 chapters, so I like to kind of narrow it down for you. But you need to know about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These are called the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Even though Lincoln had given his Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, this was an official amendment added to the Bill of Rights that said slavery will be outlawed. 3 years later, in 1868, the 14th Amendment basically, the 14th, oh yeah, which school is near the train tracks? Is that Panama?
Yeah.
Okay. The 14th Amendment basically said all Americans will be recipients of the Bill of Rights, the 10 amendments for the Bill of Rights, except for one group. Can anybody guess? And it's not African Americans, because they are included. There's one group that the 14th Amendment did not count for.
Native Americans?
Native Americans, right. They don't get added until around the beginning of the 1900s. And of course, we're going to, once we finish Reconstruction, we will go into the Indian Wars that the United States had. And then the 15th Amendment in 1870 gave African American males the right to vote. 1870. So even though they're free in 1865, after the Civil War, they cannot vote until 5 years later. Now, African American women could not vote. Could white women vote in 1870? How many of you would say yes? Raise your hand. How many of you would say no, white women couldn't vote in 1870? White women. How many of you are scared to raise your hand? Women did not get the vote. Ladies in the class, you need to know this. You need to celebrate it. You need to be happy, because this is 2020 is 100 years since women got the vote in 1920. So this is a celebration year for women and having the right to vote. All right, just a little bit of more bonus trivia there for you. Moving on. Okay, I've already talked about the physical reconstruction, the economy, the government, 13th Amendment. This will all be uploaded onto the course homepage in a little bit. More information about the 13th Amendment. Now, even though we celebrate that they received their freedom, if we think about it, all they got was freedom. They didn't have any land. They didn't have, African American slaves did not own businesses. And so when they were free, they were just kind of out there on their own. Many of them did migrate north and west into the Northeast. Many of them started searching for their relatives. And then others were legally married, because a lot of them could not be legally married as slaves. In 1865, you need to know this organization, the Freedmen's Bureau. This was a part of the 13th Amendment. This was formed to help the freed African American slaves, help them get food and medical services, started establishing schools, employee-employer relationships with contracts began to surface. And then what the North did was they confiscated a lot of the land that plantation owners had owned, and they started giving that land away to freed slaves. All right, we're going to stop there so we can pick up on, well, not till next Wednesday. Actually, this is what I'm going to do. I told you that I have to have something for you on Fridays. So what I will do is I will finish this presentation on Reconstruction. I will video it, and I will make that available on Friday. You can watch it over the weekend. Actually, you have until next Wednesday. And so then we'll pick up in chapter 16 on Wednesday. Hopefully everybody will have their textbooks. Let's check the course homepage real quick for assignments. So if you haven't given your initial response yet to the discussion question, that is due on Sunday by midnight. And then you need to reply to at least 3 of your classmates by Tuesday, the 21st. Our first quiz will be, well, I say that, hopefully you're going to have your textbooks, but if some of you don't get them until Tuesday or Wednesday and you haven't had time to read the chapters, we will probably reschedule quiz 1. But I will have this video and the slides and then the instructions to this report assignment posted this afternoon. Any questions? So, did anybody read about the "Yo Captain, My Captain"? Good. I like that title. Anyway, have a great weekend and a great holiday, and we will be seeing you next Wednesday. Be looking for the video on Friday. If there's no questions, bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.